Welcome back. Today, I speak with Dr. Victoria Stewart. Dr. Stewart has a PhD in history, and her dissertation compared conscription policies in the Union and Confederacy, focusing specifically on those who resisted such policies. Currently, she is an assistant professor at Northwest Florida State College, where she teaches classes on American history and American government. Our discussion centers mostly on the Civil War and the rise of conscription policies, discussing things like the draft riots in New York City in 1863, as well as the ways in which such policies were resisted in the Confederacy, the cost of citizenship, and then, even more broadly, to the importance of learning history. This does not mean learning from history, but to learn history, to learn about people in the past for the sake of learning about people in the past. I greatly enjoyed speaking with Dr. Stewart. I hope you will as well. Here is my conversation with Dr. Stewart. Hi, Victoria.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good.
So as a way of introduction, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, what your dissertation was on, and where you're teaching?
I finished my dissertation in 2017. It's a work in U.S. legal history where I compared conscription policies in the Union and Confederacy, and I really focused on those that tried to disobey those policies. So by deserting or resisting the policies. And currently I teach at Northwest Florida State College as an assistant instructor, and I teach history and some government courses.
Terrific. So you are the perfect person to have on today to talk about conscription and its relationship to the broader American Republic. So I think I've got a few questions here. If we can answer some boilerplate stuff right out of the beginning. Can you define what is conscription and how was it implemented?
Conscription originated really in France at the really later part of the 18th century, and it was what they called the levée en masse, and it was this really quick way to muster men into military service because there were concerns about having enough people to serve in the military at the time. And so by the time the United States used conscription, it had already seen really it in practice before. And so it was modified in the United States, and it doesn't take effect until the American Civil War, although at the end of the War of 1812, there were efforts to try to implement conscription, and really it's mandatory military service to the state is what conscription is. That's something I would get all the time because people call it other things. They call it the draft or compulsory military service, but legally speaking, it's always just been referred to as conscription.
Terrific. So if it originates in the French, this is during the Republic that this is happening, or was this happening under Napoleon?
It was like 1793, I believe, is the first instance that we saw it used.
Okay. So right up in there, somewhere in the revolutionary government. Yeah. Interesting. So somehow it is fundamentally connected to at least one notion of republicanism. And I want to get to that. I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation. So since you've talked about conscription, or you've researched conscription broadly from the Civil War up through Vietnam.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think I want to start then and primarily focus on, if you're comfortable with this, on just the stuff in the Civil War for the most part, maybe getting to where we change conscription or the nationalization of it, perhaps in World War I, and get to that. But can we start first with the conscription riots, the so-called draft riots that happened in New York City as a response to the Emancipation Proclamation? Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the conscription order and the Emancipation Proclamation?
That's a good question. So historian James McPherson first made that connection in his book For Cause and Comrades. And it's a pretty dated book as far as history is concerned, but it's really important because his book details these opinions and ideas of those living at the time. So he uses diaries and things that were very personal to really capture people's attitudes. about this. So the Emancipation was issued in January of 1863, and then the draft comes about in March of 1863. So just weeks later, because there's a huge spike in desertion in the Union Army following the Emancipation. And a lot of scholars have since, reaffirmed McPherson's argument that it was in response to that because it changed the war aim from a war to reunify the Union to a war now to end slavery.
So that's awfully interesting because there's a whole lot of layers going on there. The inherent sort of racism that you had seen in the Northern Army, if there's a mass desertion from this, the impact that was recognized, because there's still a vast argument today about what was the nature of the Civil War. Was it a war to end slavery or did it serve a different function? And here, implicitly, if there's a desertion because of the Emancipation, it means at first it couldn't have been understood in that way. But then in the popular mindset, somehow the Emancipation makes it into such. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I do, and some other scholars have said that in him doing that, in Lincoln making explicitly the war aim being one to end slavery, it was a way to try to get the Europeans, particularly the British, to help with the Union cause. Doesn't happen, but a lot of people have since argued in him doing that intentionally, it was a way to try to get that support.
It's an interesting thing that the more you read into Lincoln's thought after the Emancipation, he very much understands that there has to be not even just a legal grounding, but a rhetorical grounding in that speech or in the proclamation to justify it. That he really goes to the extent to say, if we don't remedy this problem of slavery, we're going to doom ourselves to subsequent civil wars. So in a certain sense, the idea of, that the war was to preserve the Union or it was about slavery, he sort of argues, in essence, it's the same cause. But it's interesting how that doesn't necessarily disseminate out, and yet because it inspires this kind of virulent reaction in the North.
Well, because he gave that speech that the United States could not exist half slave, half free.
Right.
And so he gave that speech well in advance of the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think you're right that he's making those connections, that really him preserving the Union is not a dissimilar issue from projecting this idea of this being a war to, emancipate slaves and end that system.
And it's so interesting that, like, House Divided is in 1858, if I recall correctly, that this is what gave the big spook to the Southerners and sort of helps precipitate the cause of separation or the attempt at secession. And yet Lincoln, prior to the Emancipation was going, no, guys, you're reading this wrong. I'm making an empirical argument, not a prescriptive one. And yet then he finds himself sort of, on the cusp of history, so to speak, having to deal with this problem. So can you speak any more about the riots that ensued after this and the reaction? How effective was conscription? What was the reaction to it? And what sort of precedent did it set going forward for the Republic?
Well, what's really interesting about the draft riots in New York is that they were roughly around the same time that Gettysburg took place. So actually those that survived Gettysburg had to go and quell the riot. So you can imagine them having survived this really epic 3-day battle, then now to go to New York and save New York from these riots. And so, you can imagine them, having to emotionally deal with all of that, having to survive and then having to address this turmoil. But I think what's also maybe misunderstood about the draft riots is what they really targeted. So they targeted things that obviously would disrupt the draft. So the headquarters where they're, having names collected of those draft eligible, but they also attacked like orphanages and other types of, infrastructure in New York that was really just devastating, that a lot of people now, didn't understand what that had to do with disruption of the draft at all. But I think what it tells you is that in that summer, even after, people felt that Gettysburg really was this turning point, that there was a lot of turmoil, and the draft riot is a good example of that. And as far as I guess, likelihood of you getting out of the draft depended and how you tried to get out of it. If you tried to fake a medical condition, if you tried to flee to Canada. So most people equate that fleeing to Canada is something done in the Vietnam War, but they did that during the Civil War as well.
How about that?
There was actually an executive order by Lincoln to restrict that and to prohibit those of draft eligibility from going to Canada. So even if you hadn't been drafted yet, it was a restriction on you from moving in the event that you would. There's also legally, you had to be issued the summons. So sometimes they would just be out of their house all day. So in case the agent came, well, I wasn't there to receive the summons. So clearly I wasn't drafted. They would publish the names in the newspaper though. So if you read the newspaper, you would know that you were formally drafted. So they tried to get around the official issuance of the summons. But I mean, faking medical conditions and all these things, I mean, it's extreme what some of them were doing to mutilate themselves to get out of service. We see it in subsequent wars too, but.
Well, and then there's also some of that I didn't know. That's really interesting. But then there's also the class element where you could buy your way out, right? Could you speak to some of that?
Yeah, it was called the commutation fee. And the American Civil War is the only conflict in which you could do that, also the substitution. But you also had to pay your substitute. So, I mean, that's also, you know, into your discussion in class. Like if you could afford a substitute, not everyone could do that either. And the commutation fee was $300 that you would pay directly to the U.S. government. Substitutes you would pay to the person serving in your place. And I've studied what I call draft clubs. Just really don't know what else to call them, but there are these particular communities that would raise money. So in the event someone got drafted, they could draw from that pool of money to excuse their member of their community from service. And so I call it like draft insurance almost, or a way for them to collectively try to unite themselves as a community to excuse somebody. And the government didn't like that either. So there's restrictions once the federal government found out communities were doing this too.
So it's almost like an analog GoFundMe, but for draft service. Interesting. And unless I'm misremembering this, $300 was like a year's wages or something like this. It was a relatively large sum of money.
Oh yeah, I mean, mortgage their homes to try to get that money. I mean, sell property. I mean, they were really desperate to get that money if they felt that could excuse them. Something else that's interesting, I know we're talking about the Union, but in the Confederacy, they had substitution as well, but they changed the law. And so if you had gotten a substitute when it was permissible, in the event that they changed it when they did, you were then liable for service, even though you fostered a substitute.
Interesting.
So a lot of unrest in the South too.
Well, that actually was, this is a perfect segue into my next question to talk about, because there is conscription on both sides of the Civil War. How much of internal turmoil was there into the Confederacy? And I'm asking this question almost as an overarching reflection on the Civil War itself. We sometimes have a tendency, we do this with the American Revolution too, to truncate it down to like a paragraph of data, and it makes things very clean, where having experienced it, it is not a clean experience at all. The American Revolution was almost, I think it's fair to call it the first American Civil War, in the way that it splits in half between the loyalists and then the rebels. And here the draft riots show so perfectly the way in which there wasn't sort of national unity behind Lincoln. I mean, the election of 1864 is deeply contested until after the battles out west. And I imagine that the South, with its fundamental principle of disunion, even within the Confederacy, that there have to be examples of this there too. Could you speak to some of that?
What I think is interesting in having studied both systems is that the target of violence in the North is typically those in charge of the draft or the military, and the target of violence in the South is the government itself. And so when they had these riots, so in the South they had riots as well, but they would target members of government in their efforts of resistance. They had a bread riot, for example, in the Capitol in the Confederacy, and it was mostly women and young children that were protesting to try to get their husbands or, family members back from service. And arms were almost turned on them to dispel them. And keep in mind, this is women and children in protest. They're starving, they don't have food. And so the government's almost initial response was to harm them, to get them to disperse. It doesn't happen, but I think it's interesting that each of these sides really identified a different, I guess, responsible entity. And so whether it's the military itself or the federal government, as they perceived it, was the core of their, I guess, disagreement, how they felt to protest. That was the target of their protest.
Well, and that's so interesting because the highlighting of women and children, in a certain sense, you get that image from like the sinking of the Titanic and having to put the women and children on the boats first. But this would have been anathema to Southern virtue. I mean, the idea, this is an aristocratic society that is fundamentally at its heart, we could call it patriarchal. I don't think that's far at all. And that their defense of women and children is, bone deep. And the idea that this would turn, that shows you the level of desperation. And I think this is worth sort of highlighting. But it also reflects, and I would love to go into this a bit further, the way in which the principles that were sort of animating the Confederacy, because this again is deeply controversial now, and it probably is going to be for the remainder of our history, I would assume, that what animated the Confederates to leave. You have sort of the glorious cause sort of stuff, this silly notions of what animates it. And then you have people like, Shelby Foote, who makes his arguments 20 years ago or 30 years ago now, I suppose, about that, why did the Southerners take up arms? Because the Northerners were here. They were on our land. But the way in which you've even framed this in terms of conscription, I think gives us an insight, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, an insight into the way that the people understood their relationship to their government.
Well, and I think it's interesting because in the Confederacy, they started conscripting a year before the Union. So they already had a system in place a whole year before, March of 1863. And what was different about the conscription policy in the Confederacy is that in addition to conscripting new, young, able-bodied men into service, is that they extended your term if you were already enlisted. So if you thought you were only there for your 9 months or your 1 year, well, too bad, because the conscription law actually extended your term of service anyway. So in addition to getting new people, you had to stay longer. And that caused a lot of anger, especially among those that felt that this is what I agreed to, and, this extension is not what I agreed to. And so that already kind of chipped away at some of their attitudes about what the government was requiring of them. And that caused a lot of anger. So if you read some of these diaries, they're writing to their loved ones and they say, hey, I know you thought I was coming home, but not now. And you can sense that they didn't plan for that. And so they thought they'd be home in time for the growing season or in time for certain events in the family, and they couldn't do that. And so that caused a lot of anger. But something else that's interesting I've seen as far as how those in the South versus those in the North dealt with the draft is that in the South, they had such a negative view of the drafted men because they felt like you had to be put here and you didn't choose this. And so there's a lot of animus that you could see in these letters too, like, oh, we just got a group of conscripts coming in. And instead of trying to welcome them and get them into, the rank and file, I mean, there's a lot of distrust in having them there and a lot of anger that this is what compelled you to be in service, is that you had to. You didn't volunteer like I did. And so there's a lot of anger in that. And in the Union, what you see as far as the conscripts is that some of them were very disruptive. And they wanted to interfere, and they felt that if they were so disruptive, they'd ultimately be sent home because there might be decisions made that it's safer that you're not in service, that you're actually a danger to everybody. And But there is some distrust on both sides, but really for different reasons.
Now, that's so interesting because in some ways there's been an attempt, I think wrongly in some ways, but there's an attempt to sort of draw anti-federalism to principles in the Confederacy, this idea of deep civic mindedness and civic sacrifice and the willingness to engage in these things. But this already sort of highlights how those principles never were entrenched, never were instantiated, even in the Confederacy, where they fundamentally were arguing the superiority of themselves. You can see this in multiple writings across the South, that we are superior to the Northerners because we produce more virtuous people, we have better, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And yet here, this is highlighting, in some ways, I suppose, a parallel that you see in the Vietnam conscription, and yet there the animus seems to, again, to be to the military, not necessarily to the officer, but there's not a way that Americans differentiate. Do you think that's an appropriate parallel to draw to how the Union saw it? But the Confederacy here, again, is blaming the individual because it's requiring the power of the state to force them into it, which kind of undermines the whole principle that they are driving for in their secession.
I think that's right too. And even in the Union, they had allowed the states to make decisions about filling the quota. And so states did have a greater role in the Union initially to make those decisions. But then when it was federal, we see that removal of the states to have a role, largely because governors interfered. And so if they had a quota, you need to send 10,000 individuals. Wisconsin, for example, would send like 500. Like nowhere near the thousands that they were required to send. So I think you're right that the federal government had to take that role if they were going to do this effectively, because we can't rely on the states to send what we're asking for. And I think you're right. I think that's why they felt that the military was to be the target of their means of protest, because the military is who would come up with the list and come up with the quota numbers. And so they felt they were the ones responsible, requiring their service and putting them in that situation to make those tough decisions.
So this raises an interesting question about federalism, which I want to get to here in a bit. But before we get to it, I do want to have you explain the relationship between the Second Amendment and conscription.
Yeah, you said that the other day when we were talking before this, and I didn't put it together, and I've thought about it a lot since. But militia service, because I've studied a little bit about the militia as really this transformation into federal conscription. But you're right. So militias were run by the states before we had federal conscription. And then the states would have requirements of what that meant. So if you had to drill regularly, if you had to arm yourself, for example, the state of Illinois, you had to arm yourself. That was the militia requirement of the state. And so again, taking you to the connection of the Second Amendment. And in the Civil War, once we had federal conscription, you were actually given credit if you could arm yourself and show up and honor, your draft summons, and you could, provide your own weaponry. And so some did, because again, this legacy of militia service, most of them had to. So most of them had this equipment that they could bring with them instead of, having it been supplied.
So that it's so interesting because like the underlying principle, at least to my read of the Second Amendment, and again, we're not covering anything anyone can get upset about here, that my read of the Second Amendment is very much that it's entrenching an individual right because there's a public service. You're going to participate in the militia, therefore you have the ability to have this weapon. And conscription seems to be the logical extension of that a militia is sort of instead of a voluntary association, it's an involuntary pulling forth of the militia, presuming that all of the able-bodied men at this point would have been able to serve in the military and shoot their musket. And so that's the attachment there seems apt, but the relationship there that's so interesting to me, why do we have a Second Amendment? I'm not sure it's terribly controversial among historians. It's terribly controversial today in our political rhetoric, but it really seems to be based on the primary documents of the time. They didn't want a standing army. And because they didn't want a standing army, people have the right to have their own firearms. What happens when those people don't show up? And that seems to be the issue here that's underlying conscription. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's a good point too, because if you look at the size of the standing military over time, it shrinks right after the conflicts in which you had conscripted soldiers and service members and so on. And so, I mean, World War I's a good example. They had less than 300,000 total enlisted members of the military, officers, everybody, at the outset of U.S. involvement. And so Wilson knew right away that's not going to work. If we're going to be involved. And so I think you're right. So the fact that the military, the standing military would be that small tells you something. And the fact that conscription is used reliably to expand the size very short and very quickly. That's why it's been done several times in our history.
So where I kind of want to go now that we've sort of laid these groundworks or frameworks a bit, is to push this a little bit further into questions of tracing how things have developed and the principles that are kind of animating them. So, for example, in the Civil War, the argument about what does federalism mean, and by here I guess I'll provide a quick short definition of federalism is the distribution of power between branches of government and between tiers of government. So horizontally between the branches and then vertically between the national government and then the state governments. Which one of those is supposed to be the dominant force? And so what is interesting to me is that both answers to that, which is the federal government or the state governments, have to rely on conscription to enforce their interpretation. Mm-hmm. So the interesting part on that is, so then what really it comes down to is Lincoln lays out in the second inaugural, it's the success of the war that really is going to answer that question. But as you've highlighted, the resistance or the reticence of Union citizens to comply to this command and not to rely on the voluntary nature. How successful was conscription in the North?
I don't know what you mean by success. Like how many people they got in?
Right, relative to the number that they called for.
It was relatively successful. And the reason why I say that is because once in service, there are some issues once in, and there are maybe some problems getting people there. But the other thing too, if you received your summons, you were deemed a deserter in 10 days if you didn't show up. So you were still recognized as having to comply. And there were roughly 250,000 deserters in the Union. And that shows you, that was kind of a tactic used pretty frequently. But also, if you were enlisted, some of them just walked home and just left. So, even though they showed up, maybe served a little bit, and then just went home. That's actually something that happened in the War of 1812. And they thought that they would need conscription because so many of them left before the war was actually over. But the war ends before they needed that. But that's a concern. They had some issues with if they have a sizable military to continue the fighting.
It's an interesting thing because Washington complains about that so much in the early parts of the Revolution. I just can't keep people here. And the ones that I can keep here are broken and bruised and beaten. And how am I supposed to fight this thing without a loyal, set, deep well of soldiers? And that seems to be a perennial problem that faces America, because how do you reconcile, and this is one of those fundamental questions about living in a free society, how do you reconcile the need for national security with the reality that may call upon your citizens to die in service of the national security? I would say perhaps we don't have a very good answer to that question. because it's probably the defining question of how do you balance living in a free society with the constraints of keeping it free. But what I like here about the Civil War, I'm always a fan of muddying waters in history, because it becomes very easy to go, weren't they so terrific? They were so much better than we are. No, they were very similar to how we are. They didn't have air conditioning and email and stuff, but they're very similar to us in the same sense that they were terrified of dying.
Oh yeah.
And, but enough of them were animated by, well, and perhaps you can speak on that a bit too. Having read diaries and primary sources from the time, can you speak to the motivations of the soldiers that do serve and stay, perhaps on both the Union and the Confederacy?
A lot of it is really defensive community. And so I think what's also interesting about the Civil War is that community to them was their immediate community,
Right.
not United States community, not the Confederate States community. But for them, they believe that if I am in service, I'm going to protect my immediate community somehow. That maybe we'll keep the fighting away, or maybe we'll keep enough interest and keep enough in service to make sure that others don't have to serve and I can protect others in my community. And that's something that's similar. So even if they lived in the North or the South, they had that idea of community and that service of their community. But if you read some of the reasons why they didn't want to serve, I mean, it's pretty human responses. I read one court case where a young man was charged for, trying to pay this money into this draft club. And so he asked why he paid, and he said, I want to live.
Yeah.
That's an honest answer. I mean, it's something that hit me in my stomach when I read it. I mean, he was younger than I was at the time when I read it. And I mean, that's an honest response. I mean, you see that honesty. And even in their letters, because this is before we have the censoring of soldiers' letters. So their letters are very honest about what they're feeling and thinking. And so it's an awesome, resource for us reading it so many years later.
Well, and perhaps you could speak a bit to, I don't know how much you've engaged in military history and studying these things, but there's always a looming threat of death in a war. That's its nature. But it's a particularly looming threat in the 19th century, 18th century. I mean, it's a particularly looming threat until like the second half of the 20th century because of disease, far more than even just battle. So if you could speak to that a bit.
So there's a good book on this by Drew Faust. So she writes Republic of Suffering. And so each of her chapters, she focuses on a certain aspect of a lot of their anxieties about death. And in the 19th century, what's really important about death and dying is that they had to have this like honorable, noble death, or they felt they wouldn't go to heaven. And so that caused like increased anxiety. So if they died alone, if they died and were buried in an unmarked, unnamed grave, this is before dog tags. So they tried to think of ways to identify their own body. They're writing on their arms or pinning a piece of paper to the inside of their coat with their names on it because that meant something to them. They also had like mascots, so like dogs that would travel with these units. So then the dogs could be sent out and accompany those dying on the battlefield so they weren't alone. And that's something that shocks my students when I tell them that. They're like, oh my gosh, that's so horrific, that them feeling like they're dying alone meant that they wouldn't get a good afterlife. And so I'm like, yeah, that's compounding their anxiety about death already, is the fact that they're not going to go to heaven after all of this struggle. And you're right. So they didn't have an idea about germ theory. They had not even created the Sanitation Commission in the Union until sometime into the war. And I mean, when these nurses showed up at these field hospitals, I mean, they were like horrified at what was happening. They're like, what do you mean you're not boiling bandages, and treating patients? Like, what's happening here? And I mean, it's pretty remarkable to think about what they endured and the fact that embalming was fairly new. And that was a way to try to get bodies back to families and bury them in a family cemetery. And there's horror stories about that going totally awry and the body coming to the family and it's not in good condition. And horrific for the family, and using, ice to pack the coffins and shipping them. And I mean, and I think to a point you made earlier, is a lot of the reason why there was a lot of anxiety in service is because they would see the condition that their, members of community would come home. Look at Bob, he's really badly hurt. He needs a prosthetic, or, he's got a lot of issues, now that he's back in service. And so that caused a lot of anxiety about them volunteering enlisting in this, because they're like, well, I don't know if I want to do that, because look at my friend and the condition he came back in. So another point of anxiety.
Yeah, the way you were describing the solitariness of dying in a battlefield, it makes me think of Tolkien and in The Hobbit, and the way that you have your solitary hero who's fighting, or basically fighting for his life inside of a cave, but it's a really solitary experience. Fictional stories about war didn't do that up until after these sorts of experiences, probably for this very reason. Before, even in the beginning of the war, and certainly this would be another thing to speak to, the silly notion that it was going to be short and glorious, and that people at the very early battles would come out and watch it like it was theater, until they saw, Timmy from the town just lost his leg or more. So can you perhaps speak to some of that, and the way that the framing of the expectation of the war also contributes to the breakdown in morale and the rest?
I think that's right. And so we do see a spike in, voluntary enlistment really at the end of 1862 in the Union. And that's because we had like a string of really large, as far as casualties concerned, conflicts, those engagements. And so that really discouraged people from enlisting, when they're seeing how heavy these death tolls are. So they're like, oh, this is not something that is going to be over soon. And I think when they saw the war kind of drag on, and that's, you're seeing conscription happen in 1863 and used for us the rest of the conflict. But I think you're right. And that expectation of service too. So it's like, I know this is tough, but you got to do this. Like, this is your responsibility, your duty. And so if you look at any of those posters, I mean, it's lots of patriotic images and, the eagle soaring, and, you need to do this, for the better of the nation. And I mean, the Militia Act was created in 1862 as a way of trying to use the militia. So they're like, oh, well, you're required to do militia service anyway, so it's not so bad. We're just using a system already in existence. That didn't work because they didn't get enough people. And then federal conscription happens about 6 months later from that even.
So what is so interesting about all of this, there's a lot that's interesting, but the thing that constantly speaks to me is the way in which the Union, I'm going to be controversial here and say I think the Union was right in the Civil War. I think they were on the correct side in the struggle. But the way in which even they couldn't compel enough of their people, and there were so many more people in the Union than in the Confederacy, that it drug the war on for 4 years, which to us, so we're recording this in late summer of 2020, and we've been at war in Afghanistan for rolling into, it'll be 20 years next year. And the intense brutality of the 4 years of the American Civil War, and the way that we've never overcome that, in a certain sense, that the culture really never fixed itself, that we've always continued to have these sort of animating animus. And I have to wonder how much of that is driven by the transformation from what was in essence a decentralized conception of government, where the states were mostly in charge and your localities were really the important thing, to the necessity of nationalizing in order to meet the threat. Do you think that that's a fair assessment, and we see that in conscription?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because once they created conscription, they were federal agents. that would go into these communities and draw up the lists. And you had the rank of captain, even without any other previous military experience. So you can imagine those that are going to come in as a private, having been drafted, that's going to cause you to be a little upset that somebody here, this political appointment, is going to come into your community and tell you that you need to go serve now. And so I think you're right, because these federal agents really were the arm of how they're trying to make conscription successful. And they were the ones having to arrest deserters. 38 of them end up dying because they get shot to death. There's a lot of response against them. So if you think about it, from March of 63 to the end of the war, 38 federal agents died in service to the Union. I've studied several of them, and I mean, they're just showing up to do their job, and they're really the targets of that violence, and they do die in pretty horrific ways trying to enforce.
It's interesting because the parallel that you see there, we would be aghast at that today, rightfully so, but we would be aghast, which shows how we've centralized our identity as a nation in the individuals in the country, how this is so much closer to the way that the colonists rebelled against the British, going against British emissaries from the government and not seeing them as one of us. They're against us. And how that's still true in the Union in 1864.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the South didn't have that same type of centralization. They had the Bureau of Conscription, which was it was really like an offshoot of the federal government. I don't really have a lot on what they did. My advisor, when I was working on my doctorate, he said, maybe they didn't do much. Maybe that's why you can't find much.
Yeah, right. Yes, fair enough.
He said, well, the fact that they created like this branch, essentially, like this offshoot of the, government for them to oversee that, but they were very ineffective too at making sure people were showing up and doing their job. And so it was tough in both the Union and Confederacy.
Well, so in the way that, and please correct me if I don't understand this correctly, the Confederacy does not have an army. The Confederacy has armies of different locations, which is a reflection of their form of government. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And as opposed to the Union, which very much does. You have the Union Army and then against all of these various armies from the Confederacy. So how does that impact the Confederate notion of the army? Does that have an impact on conscription, the sort of decentralized thing? Or was there an attempt, you're pointing here to a bureau that's not terribly effective. Were there ways to work around it, or was it just less effective in the Confederacy?
I think that's a good point. And what I found interesting is that their solution to a lot of this resistance was just to give exemptions. But then you're exempting too many people, so then you don't have the military you need to keep fighting the war. So it wasn't effective at all. But I think you're right. And I think what's different about the Confederacy is that their immediate connection as far as military service was, again, their community. Like, I'm serving for Mississippi. I'm serving for, whatever state. And depending on the state, I've done some preliminary research on the state of Florida, is when they actually started conscripting from the state of Florida, they would serve in units in Alabama or Georgia. So they're not fighting for Florida in that sense. And that made them very angry because, they're like, oh, we're getting conscripted and I'm not even fighting for the state that I represent. And that caused a lot of anger too, because each state had a quota. So if you're taken out of Florida to serve for one of these other states, you're not being counted as the quota for Florida.
Right.
So that causes a lot of anger too.
It's interesting how what could be an animating principle for the secessionist, which when you read the articles of secession and their constitution, it's mostly clear. I mean, their national constitution is not terribly different than the Union Constitution, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
The only major difference is the recognition of the hierarchy of race, which is anathema to the national constitution, and very much the delegation of more power to the state governments than to the national government, right? Mm-hmm. But how in practice, in the heat of war, those principles sometimes have to get a bit blurry. That, if Alabama needs to hit their thing, I'm sorry if you're, up in the panhandle, you're coming with us. And how that already itself is almost reflecting what they consider to be the violation that's coming from the Union, breaking state sovereignty. I didn't know that. That's an interesting element. When I was in DC pre-COVID, and we went out and to why am I blanking on the name? We went out to Lee's house, which is when we stood there. The name will come to me here in a second. I'll have to edit all this out. Arlington National Cemetery is where General Lee's plantation was. And when you stand at the reconstruction of his house, you can look in and see downtown DC. You can see the house, and you can see Congress. What it reminds me of in the way that you're describing it, and maybe you can go into it a bit more, speaking to the biographical impact, or let's say using more recent language, the lived experience of the people who endured it, how terribly intimate and destructive the war was, because basically everything happened in their backyards. And all of the war was really concentrated within like 150-mile range. I mean, you had some stuff out west, but even it's pretty concentrated in very narrow strips. So if you could speak to some of that.
I think that's a good point. And, I give my students all these statistics of really these death tolls and just how huge of a loss it was as far as casualties and wounded after the American Civil War. And I mean, it's like, I can't even wrap my brain around it. I mean, I read these numbers all the time, and I tell my students, I said, we need to look past the numbers, because I think we get lost sometimes and we just see a total, and we don't think that that's Bob Jones of this community. And so I spend a lot of time reading diaries and things to the students. I do dramatic readings in class, and usually they cry in class. And I mean, that's not my intent to make people sad all the time, but I think it humanizes that. And I think
exactly
it sometimes, we see, 700,000 or 800,000, and the number has increased over time because we see census records and they don't show up anywhere else. And so sometimes families thought that their relative just didn't come home, started a new life, and so they didn't realize that they just died. And so it's sad, and I teach this when I teach about Reconstruction. I tell them, like, the weight of that term. I mean, they're reconstructing the nation, getting everybody back into the Union, getting new state constitutions. They're reconstructing broken infrastructure. I mean, everything that was destroyed in the war, but they're also reconstructing what it means to be American and what it means to be a part of this country. And that's a huge adjustment for some. And so I teach them about about these visions of the post-war world,
Well, and it's interesting. I've spent some time with Du Bois' account of the failure of the Freedmen's Bureau, and which I still think is, as terms of, it's not a direct primary document, but it's pretty. I mean, it's close. But but his assessment is terrific on the aspiration versus the implementation, and what a perfect parallel to Reconstruction itself, to aspire to reconstruct the country, but we only get the recon. It never really sort of takes root. So if you want to speak to a little bit more of that and the personal effect, because what is really interesting to me through this lens of conscription is, what do you do? Plato talks about this. What do you do with these people that you've had to turn into killers, and then you bring them back home and go, okay, now be back, and you can't be this way anymore?
It's hard. And I don't study it a lot, so I can't really speak so much to this. But what I also find really interesting about the Civil War is also a lot of these lingering issues that never get resolved. PTSD, some of these, issues that they have upon reentry into like civilian society that they don't get medical care for, or even recognized as being something that happened because of the trauma of battle. And a lot of this stuff is also fraught because we see such a hole in those that died. So a lot of these jobs they performed and, you know, how they fit into society, I mean, they're just gone. And so, I mean, that's really shocking. And also, you know, in light of Reconstruction, I mean, it just ends. I mean, it's
Right.
such a prompt. I mean, I teach students about it. I'm like, yeah, they basically just pulled the funding for it and like, that's it. Like the Freedmen's Bureau, like they're gone and the agents just have to leave. And it's such an abrupt, I mean, it happens in about 1872, they get their funding pulled, and 1877 we kind of see as the end of Reconstruction. And so these issues aren't resolved. I mean, I mean, it's just not, it's not a done issue after that.
Yeah, and it entrenches the failures for the next century, more than the next century, you know, as sort of political chicanery that's going to doom future generations to suffer the same fraught problems that they endured. Perhaps a useful lesson to all of us living in a republic. Try to doom the future a little less. Don't abandon the cause when it's inconvenient. But now, if you've got a little bit more time, I would love to get into some of these other bigger thematic questions, but using maybe the First and Second World Wars as a way of doing it, since the Civil War really, in some ways, shatters the reality of what the federal system looked like from the antebellum period. It's gone. But then through the Gilded Age, so named, we emerge into the progressive era. And by that point, there's major pushes to centralize and democratize. It's one of those nice, fun bifurcations. How do we see that also sort of playing out, as you've made reference to already, in the First World War and the need to arm up very quickly? I mean, we didn't know that we were only going to be there for a smattering of months, but when we plunge in 1819, excuse me, 1817 or 1917, right? That when we plunge in then, what is sort of the reality in relative to conscription, to the military service in general, and to the relationship that people sort of saw to the national government?
Oh, it's one of my favorite things to talk about because I think it's so clever of President Wilson. So he knew that conscription would be a bad idea. Like he just knew it would be resisted against. He knew there's going to be a lot of upset. And so he's the one that calls it selective service.
Ah,
Because he wanted to make it special. Like you were selected for the service. So no one was allowed to call it conscription. You weren't allowed to call it the draft. So it was selective service. And also what I find really interesting about World War I is we use the word slacker, right? Like, oh, that person's a slacker. Slacker in World War I meant that you did not comply with selective service. So you didn't register, you didn't show up, like whatever. So that was like a legal term for you. So you were a slacker if you didn't comply. And what also is really interesting is that they removed a lot of the ways that you could get out of it. So, you know, we removed the commutation fee, the substitution. And so World War I mean, there were far fewer ways for you to get out of service in that way if you had financial means. I mean, there's still the medical stuff and other exemptions you could obtain, but those, you know, it didn't spare you this time. And you were actually given the day off if there was the registration day. So they removed the military from registering you because they thought that was what was the core of this, you know, upset was that the military registered you. So you had to register yourself. And so that's still something we see, you know, 18-year-olds now having to register themselves.
Remember.
SARS, yeah. SARS and World War I is you had that responsibility to register yourself. But it's hugely controversial. There's a lot of protests against it. And actually, they were drafting men so quickly and so many that they didn't even have enough camps for them to train. So they were actually building the barracks for themselves to sleep in that night when they would show up. I mean,
Really?
because they did not have it ready for them to be drafted in mass at that time. So
That's so interesting. It makes me wonder if Wilson understood why it was going to be so unpopular because he was a Southern Democrat and he understood the sort of hangovers, because he wasn't a spry chicken by the time he becomes, I mean, he's born before the Civil War, if I remember correctly. He's a young man during it, or right thereafter. Roosevelt's also some in that same era. It makes me, it makes me wonder if the war had drug on longer than it did, than the smattering of months, if we wouldn't have seen similar fallouts and riots that emerged in the Civil War. Can you speak to that or speculate on it, I suppose?
I think what's interesting with World War One is the way that people protested was not really like the violent types of protests that they did in the Civil War. So they would have like a rally, they'd have a parade. There was a man named Charles Schenck that actually mailed out leaflets to people telling them not to comply. And so these people got arrested for being, defiant, but also trying to get those to not comply. And according to the law then, the Espionage Act, it wasn't required to prove that you actually caused anybody to desert or not comply, but that your words had the likelihood to inspire somebody not to be compliant. So, I mean, that could be almost anybody, right? And so that you see a lot of those, including Eugene Debs. He gave that speech in Canton, Ohio, and he went to jail for a while for that. And I mean, just speaking about why he disagreed with U.S. involvement, and 72% of American forces used in World War I were drafted.
Wow. I didn't know that.
World War II.
Huh. The Abrams v. Schenck is one of the most interesting Supreme Court cases to me from that era, because it does really highlight. It's before we get into what's called the incorporation cases that you get with the slaughterhouse cases 5 or 6 years later. But it's really perhaps the first test of the extent to which the First Amendment applies to individuals. And the court kind of goes, well, it doesn't really. Like, it's a big whiff and a miss from the court. And it's a fascinating look, again, into the question of civic sacrifice. You have to, in time of war, you need to support the war and hush up now.
That's what I was going to say, yeah. So does the First Amendment apply differently in times of peace versus times of war?
Right. And which today we would look at that and have lots of expletives for someone who were to say something like this. But it's a very deep or very interesting insight. And I didn't know that the degree to which conscription was used in World War I and in World War II. That's really telling. But it also in some ways speaks to why those wars are remembered as national efforts in the way that Vietnam was considered a national resistance.
Yeah, and 45% drafted in Vietnam.
45%? Mm-hmm. So
seems over time.
Well, and it also makes me wonder, Rachel Maddow, for all of her flaws, has a book out or came out a few years ago called Drift, which talks about the way that military service has become more and more constricted to fewer and fewer people, that it's not a national enterprise. And that one of the reasons is there's not this looming selective service sword of Damocles. But perhaps one of the downstream effects has been the ever increasing duration of war. Do you think that's a fair assessment from what you've read?
I think that's right. And I think what else is really interesting too is a lot of people at the time weren't sure if you could draft at a time of peace and outside of a formal declaration of war, because even in World War II, they started drafting a year and a few months before Pearl Harbor was attacked. So they started drafting in advance of that. And so there were some legal questions on whether you could compel service in the outset of a formal, declaration of war or involvement in a conflict.
Yeah, and that, of course, raises, as FDR was wont to do, try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. But the what it really raises there is, if that's the case, then if you declare a national state of emergency or a national war on poverty, say, or drugs, or pick whatever social ill, can you conscript citizens into that effort? Where it's not just a question of, even if you were to frame it in terms of national security, but it's not a war as such. Yeah, that raises a really fascinating problem that my guess is nobody wants to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Well, after the all-volunteer force in 1973, there were talks about having like civilian service for like 2 years. I mean, other countries do it. And so there were talks of that, but it doesn't really go anywhere.
Yeah,
there was that discussion on what type of even civilian service I might have to render onto the nation.
Yeah, you certainly hear that gets floated around like every presidential cycle. But what I don't ever hear anybody saying is that it's involuntary national service. And that seems to be the element here. And so maybe we can take that sort of more thematic question up now on the question of conscription and the problem with its involuntary nature and the way in which people have reacted to that over time. So however you wish to tackle that question, be my guest.
I know that feels like all my research like packed into the response. I think that's a good question. I think that's why I continue to study it. And I just find it incredibly fascinating because regardless of the time period or what national crisis or emergency, I mean, there are constant kind of themes that we have resistance. The arguments are largely the same regardless of what conflict or time period. And so it's really about like personal liberty, me having a choice to serve if I want to. And so, I mean, these ideas are still around. I mean, they're not going anywhere. I mean, even just a few months ago, there was talk about the draft coming back. And I mean, I had students that were like, Dr. Stewart, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to us? And I'm like, I don't see it. I don't see it immediately being used. I don't see it, in my personal opinion, whatever that's worth. But but there's still a lot of anxiety about it. I mean, my students are 18, 19, 20 years old, and
Right.
Maybe their parents had to serve, or however, relatives in their family, maybe they had compulsory service. My paternal grandfather was drafted to fight in World War II. He thought he was too old, but Uncle Sam did not.
Yeah.
So he served, but I mean, he went. I mean, he complied and did his service, and that was it. And so, I mean, it's something that we talk about as a family, that he did it, and he's very proud of it, and served in the Army. And so, I mean, I'm touched by it indirectly. My dad was not drafted to fight in Vietnam. He just had a really high lottery number, and he just was never drafted. So, I mean, it's something that indirectly touches a lot of us, I would imagine. I mean, mine are just my own stories, but I'm sure other people have similar things. But I think you're right that over time, I mean, it's the same issue, right? Personal freedom, personal liberty, why I should have to comply or not, and what types of exemptions can I get? So they do expand over time. So over time, I mean, there's more medical exemptions and so on. I mean, I give a list to my students, and I always, students are writing things down, right? Oh, I gotta make note of that. That's probably my thought if this comes. So, but I mean, it's something to think about, like that they feel that if they have maybe more exemptions, that maybe there's gonna be less resistance, but that also makes your pool smaller too. So I don't know, there's consequences to that too.
So do we see a number of, at 74% in World War I, which is, again, that number is going to stick with me. I had no idea it was that high. 64% in World War II sounds right to the amount of people that were affected by the war and who contributed to the war effort. What kind of resistance do we see in World War II compared to a war of similar length and in certain sense of similar scale to the Civil War? Are they similar kinds of things? Now, we don't get the letters from World War II like we do in the Civil War because they've, got to hush up now. But do you see similar kinds, or what similar kinds of arguments are you seeing made? And why were they still just as ineffective in 1843 as they were in 1863?
I think, so you mean like in World War II, like what
Yeah.
the argument? Yeah. So in World War II, it was largely, that they were being conscripted in advance of us being formally, engaged in the conflict. But then even after the attack on Pearl Harbor, troops were being sent to the Pacific Theater first, or the European theater first, and they felt that that was not appropriate given who had attacked the United States. And so their disagreement with conscription was how their service would be used. They felt that they should go to the Pacific Theater because if that's who had attacked Pearl Harbor, that's where I should go. That's the service I should render. And so I think it's more difficult as far as making the argument about necessity. I mean, given that the United States was attacked, it's a different conflict, but I guess their disagreement was execution of the war, like policy and things like that.
Though it does seem that they're both, in a certain sense, speaking to the nature to a community. The community was attacked. It's just that by the time we get to World War II, the community is the entire country instead of Virginia.
I think that's right because we see that change in how people understood and perceived themselves. So it wasn't like an immediate community of the state or the city you lived in, but it is the United States community.
Now, how much do you think that conscription contributed to that?
That's a good question. I think, especially after World War I, we see a difference because troops are being sent overseas to do the fighting. And so I think it's a different requirement of their service. And so they're building community in a different way because they're in service together overseas in this conflict. And so I think it's a different experience they have in the military. And given the volume of them conscripted, that they all are kind of a similar circumstance. And what's interesting for World War I is that even before they would show up to basic training, they would get like a pamphlet in the mail that's trying to teach them how to be a good soldier even before they show up, and like really weird things in there, but like training your body to go to the bathroom at the same time every day and like weird stuff. And yeah, so like they had to get that done before, boot camp and stuff. So I don't know, maybe they're trying to instill that sense of community even before they showed up. Like, hey, you all have to read this, come prepared and do your service.
Yeah, it just is. It continues to strike me. Do you happen to know what number of people were conscripted in the Civil War? Or is that data not really available?
Yeah, I mean, you see conflicting numbers. I mean, they said at its height, the size of the Union Army was 1 million men total. So, I mean, but it's conflicting because the records are so poorly kept. I mean, it's
A million men, and there were what, like 65 or 70 million Americans at that point, something in that ballpark, which is a pretty decent size of the country or of the Union serving in the military. Far more than today is, which is what, around 2% or less that serves. And that's where it leads me to this sort of broader question, or why conscription has been of so interest to me. One, as a selectively serviced man, or one who could be chosen up for selective service, there's a certain personal stake that's in it, even though I tend to completely agree with you that the idea of calling up a group of people today to serve in the military is not going to happen. There's no political will to enforce it. But what it seems to have done in a certain sense, or at least this is me sort of musing about it anyway, I'll see if you disagree with me, that by instilling conscription and the precedent of conscription in a war that was about the nature of federalism, by the time we get to the progressive period and its restructuring of the national government, which is pretty profound over, from Wilson to FDR, that conscription in a certain sense is a way of transmitting the idea of being an American instead of being kind of a hyphenated, if you're from Illinois, you're an Illini American or something like this, that the hyphen is broken. And now you just happen to live in this state, but your real identity is the bigger one. I wonder how much do you think that that's true, or do you see that kind of reflected in the way people speak?
I think that's true. And if you look at some of even the arguments against it, I mean, they talk about, community. We as Americans should not do this. We as Americans should not comply. And so they even speak to the, resistors in that way too. Like, we need to collectively resist this, and this is not America. We can't be compelled to this service, and government disagreed. And
Right.
I mean, but I think you're right. And I think that's where a lot of those arguments, even on both sides, they're almost making like the same argument, but in a different way, like compelling you to service because that's you as a citizen, you need to, but then others are saying, well, you're a citizen, so you have the right to oppose doing this. You have that right to protest against a government policy.
It's interesting. I just had a conversation with, I don't know if you ever knew him, Dr. Aaron Kushner. I mean, he came through similar circles to us at a certain point, but we just had a conversation about citizenship and American citizenship compared to Cherokee conceptions of it, and the way in which the American notion of the citizen is so thin, and what the thinness lets it be super malleable and can be ever expanding in its inclusivity because it's not very thick. But conscription's a pretty big thickener, that how many people really want to say, yeah, I want to be a citizen and therefore die for the country, or at least have the possibility of dying for it. And it makes me wonder because selective service ends in 1973, right?
Well, they actually suspended registration for a while too, and then Jimmy Carter brings that back.
Oh, didn't know that either. But it makes me wonder how much a certain sense, like the immigration debate that's going on today and has been going on, well, almost since that period, roughly since 1980, how much of that, and it could just be one of those cute sort of correlations that's happened in history. It's certainly not causal, but it does make me wonder about the relationship between a drive for an ever-inclusive, expansive American notion of who's a citizen with a decreasing demand of what being a citizen requires. And I wonder if, perhaps that's the underlying reason why conscription's not going to happen in our lifetime. We don't think of it as part of citizenship, but what we think of as citizen continues to thin. Do you think that that's, especially compared to the writings that you would have, come across, or the journals from the late 19th and the early 20th century, do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I think what's interesting about citizenship is that the Confederacy, in the language in their draft law, said all white, able-bodied citizens are required. And so they were eligible. But if you read the Union's draft law, it just gives you really this date range and age range. And if you were in the process of becoming a citizen, you were eligible. So that was something required of you even if you didn't have it yet. And so you were eligible because you'd be on the rolls somewhere. So they would have you as being a member of that community. And they're like, oh, look, Bob, he's old enough. Look at that. He's eligible. Let's put him in there. And so I think that's a good point as far as like who was required to serve. So in the South, they use that word citizen, like in the actual law, but in the North, they don't.
It's a bit squishier. That's interesting. I just recently watched Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York.
Yeah.
And this is something that I love me some historians and these things. I really love history, but sometimes people, when they watch history movies, forget that the important part is the movie. Because the movie has plenty of historical inaccuracies, certainly. But you let them go because it's a movie. But what it really in some ways sort of highlights in dramatic effect, not in the way you've laid it out here, the way that immigration interrelated with this problem of conscription, the new, Irish immigrants that are coming in, that all of a sudden, hey, welcome, you don't get to die from not having food, but you get to die from our friends from the South, or the way that it's going to intersect with race. And so maybe if I can ask you a question on that too, the way that conscription, do you think conscription helped lead to the desegregation of the military that we see happening, immediately after World War II, or do you think those things are unrelated?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think even, having these understandings of what was required of you, and then, they're being sent overseas and not having equality at home. I think that was that was underscored a lot and was really brought to a lot of people's attention. And I had a discussion with a friend of mine. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army, and he said that the military's pretty progressive with some of its policies, and then sometimes everything falls in line. So we see desegregation with the military before we see desegregation in other, aspects of society. And I think he'd be right. Even in the Civil War, you had women pretending to be men to serve in uniform. And if they got found out, they were sent home. And so they couldn't serve as women. And so, you're seeing restrictions as far as how people could perform service. And even now, they allowed for women to serve in combat roles, and they removed some of those restrictions, but that only happened just very recently.
Right.
And so again, the military seems to be kind of at the forefront to a lot of these, I don't want to use progressive, but significant changes in American society. So I think that's right.
Yeah, a push for more inclusivity, which may actually reinforce the things we've been talking about. The push for inclusivity may be more about need than about broad principle, or the broad principle and the need coincide. I don't want to ascribe malintent to anyone, but again, as we saw sort of in the Confederacy, our principle is to respect state sovereignty, but we need some of y'all people to hit our quota. So we're going to borrow. If there's, the extringencies that come along with the political need. I think my last question for you is a really broad one, and I'll let you go with it for as long or as widely as you want to. How can we see, or rather, can we see a change in conscription? And even delete all this. This is not good. How do we see the change in attitudes in conscription reflect the changing attitudes in the Republic on how it views itself?
That's tough, because if they keep resisting at each impasse, I don't know. Let me think about that.
Or I suppose even take it more broadly to a question of military service. How do we see the relationship of military service with the need of what America sees itself as?
Yeah, especially when we look at the 20th century, these troops are being sent overseas. So, they're not in service as they were in the American Civil War, like fighting here for this American cause. And so I think that's a good point as far as having this requirement for Americans to be conscripted in service for, these causes abroad. So I think that's interesting. And I think that's a lot of why there was a lot of, resistance to it, because they felt like this is not America's fight. This is not something we need to involve ourselves in. But people did go. They did comply, and they did serve, and they did serve very effectively and valiantly. And so those in service, to me at least, doesn't seem as though they had that conflict. They went. They felt that they were duty bound to go, and they did. Using my grandfather as an example, he went, and he served, and very bravely, was very decorated in his service, and came back and started his life. But when he talked about it, it was just something he did.
Mm-hmm.
Like, like you're a hero, man. Like
Right.
it's something you did, and so I think us trying to understand why they would do it. I mean, those that went felt that they had to, felt that that was their responsibility, and felt that maybe being Americans, that's what we needed to do. I mean, there was a war to end all wars, and they were told it was a war that was going to make the world safe for democracy. I
Yep.
mean, you have all these things. So I mean, maybe that they got wrapped up in that, and they felt like, I want to be a part of that and render that service. It's hard because I study all the people that didn't want to go. So
Right.
might not be the best at answering motivations for why those that served did. But if I'm thinking about their arguments to not serve, maybe it informs the reasons why those that served did serve.
Well, and what it does is it leads me to like the arguments of not serving in Vietnam ultimately win the day there, in a certain sense. Again, whether it's the on the ground reality or the arguments themselves. But the reason I asked that question, we almost reify people who serve in the military today, and perhaps for very good reason. But there's very much a sense of we have to honor the troops as a separate category from the citizen. And how much of a relationship do you think, or is this a downstream effect of the debates that you saw or have studied in Vietnam relative to this question of conscription?
I think it's also a good point too, because in the 20th century, the federal government now feels it has some sort of requirement to pay back those that served. And so we have the GI Bill. I mean, we have, college education kind of stuff. And these are types of benefits you get upon service. I mean, in the American Civil War, I mean, these widows are fighting for the pension for their dead husband. And I mean, sometimes unsuccessfully for a long time. And I mean, now I think we have this readjustment of what the government feels it should be doing now that service has been rendered. And so I think it's even different about not even so much like what I feel I need to do as a citizen, but also what the government feels it should do now that you served, now that you, voluntarily enlisted, now that you have completed your service. We're duty bound to provide you resources in that way. The VA, or like I said, the GI Bill, some of these things. And these things are fairly new. And these ideas of what you are due upon service. I mean, that's a new idea. Like I said, I mean, I'm sure you would know this too about the American Revolution. How many of them didn't get their pension? I mean, Joseph Plum Martin wrote his memoir because he wasn't getting his pension. He's like, look, I survived this conflict. Give me my pension.
Well, and it's now that you brought that up, I can't unsee it, because Shays' Rebellion, like the direct impetus for why our Constitution is as conservative, non-democratic as it is because they weren't getting paid. Yeah, terrific irony. And I guess I did lie. I have one last really big question, but it's more about why do you think my wife does not like history?
It's okay.
But she doesn't like history because she finds it to be off-putting and tedious because it hasn't been humanized. And I think one of the things that I've seen you do in the way that you speak about this, you do a terrific job of humanizing history. So if you want to talk about why you think that's so important and why it's important that we understand the people in the past as being like us.
So it makes me think of a conversation with my mom when I first started graduate school. I obviously started studying history, and she said, oh, you read about sad things all the time. I'm like, oh. Like, we can't stop reading about these things, because I think if we do, once we do, like, they're lost. And I mean, it's tough. I'm not going to say it's not. I mean, to read these things all the time, I mean, it's hard. Yeah. And I think you're right, that if we stop doing that, then their voices are lost. And I do dramatic readings in class. I mean, maybe the students think it's weird, but I mean, for me, it tries to teach them that these people were real people. They lived, they loved, they died, they suffered, they struggled, and they're not very different from us. They have a lot of the same concerns. They have a lot of the same fears. And I mean, if you read diaries of people living through, you know, really tough times like the Depression, you see some of those images. I mean, it's tough. And I think for me, it's always, it's in even in my teaching philosophy. I say I give a voice to the voiceless. And I believe that. And I think we need to do that, because otherwise these are just numbers on a page, you know, statistics. I mean, my grandpa could be a statistic in a history book, how many people were drafted. But I mean, for me, it's carrying on his experience. And he was a part of the D-Day invasion. And he was there D-Day +3 because he was in an armored division. So he actually drove up the beach after the initial engagement. So you can imagine what he saw 3 days later. And I think having to relay that to students, I'm like, you can imagine him driving up the beach in his tank and seeing that, like how startling that would be for him, knowing that these guys aren't going home. And they, you know, had a really tough, you know, final few moments of their life. And he actually watched it offshore before they're, you know, eventually able to go up on the beach. And I think if we lose sight of those experiences, then, you know, I mean, I'm not going to say we're going to not, you know, learn from history and repeat it. I don't believe that in that sense. But I think truly, you know, if we don't understand suffering, you know, we could prolong it or, you know, create the same conditions to repeat it in that sense.
I'm going to turn the